Well, Steph and my last recording vanished, not even a ghost of audio left behind, as if the night itself swallowed our voices. And now Steph is tucked away in her quiet corner of Brittany with no internet connection. So we have decided to step back a little, to enjoy these long summer days and listen to the bird song and watch the clouds drift against the beautiful blue Brittany skies. And take the pressure off. We're letting the extraordinarily hot weather guide us into a slightly less stressful direction. We're opening the shack door to a plethora of short summer stories. Some fictional tales that wander in from the edges of the imagination, like moths drawn to our swinging light. And some true tales from Gary D. up in Ontario, Canada, who has stepped forward with his own voice, steady, warm and threaded with the kind of mystery only real life can offer. Gary, thank you. Your stories arrive like postcards from another place, carrying their own quiet magic. And so to begin this summer's interlude, we slip into Gary's own true tale this week.
Gary D. here in Ontario, Canada, with another one of my tales of demented terror. Back when I was in my early 20s, I landed the job as a sales rep for a local phone company, and I basically sold telephones and telephone systems, fax machines, to small, medium, as well as large businesses. And the customers that I dealt with were anywhere from small businesses, mom and pop operations, where there was only one or two people in the company. I also dealt a lot with lawyers, doctors, folks that back then still had dial telephones, and we were basically trying to get them to upgrade to the newfangled push-button technology called touch tone. And a lot of these people, a lot of these businesses were set in their ways because they'd used the old type of dial phone for many decades, and it was hard for them to make the change to modern technology. So I was going in to see these customers and discussing with them, trying to convince them, saying, here are all the good reasons why you should go to a touch tone or push button phone as opposed to the old dial phone. One of the strangest things that ever happened to me was, I remember one time, I'd go to their places of business and we'd sit down and discuss everything, and I'd bring a phone with me to show them what it looked like compared to the dial phone. And it was much lighter in weight, easier to use by pressing the buttons, and would be faster. But on one occasion, I had to go visit a location that was basically a meeting place, or a hall, as they called it, for Army vets, where they all got together and they're able to talk about old times, have a beer together, play darts, that type of thing. And this place had been around for a long time. I think it was ever since the end of World War II, they'd had this thing set up. So it was a very old building. So everything was fine. I had my discussion with an elderly gentleman there, and he wasn't quite convinced about changing over to push-button phones from the dial. But we discussed it, and he discussed it with somebody else there, and they finally gave the okay. And the phones that they had used, they had for a very long time. And nowadays telephones are plugged into a telephone jack. Back in the day, there were still phones. In the 70s, even into the 80s, there were telephones that were old dial phones that were going directly into the wall, meaning there was no telephone jack, and it was called a 25-pair cable. So there was this thick cable with 24 pairs of connections in there of wires, and it went wired directly into the wall. So I got the okay, and I remember being down in the basement of this Army vet hall, and a very dingy, dark area. I think they had a couple of pool tables, ping pong table, a few dartboards, a little bar set up, and must have had a lot of interesting conversations with regards to, their times fighting in the war, talking about family, talking about a million different things. But what was strange is that after they had finally discussed it and they finally gave the go-ahead that they were going to make the change over, I had, because I was a sales rep, I had one of the techs from the phone company go there, and they went and basically removed all of the dial phones. We ripped them right out of the wall. And so they had these thick cables attached to them. And he had, I think there was either 4 or 5 of these phones, and he had put them in an old cardboard box, and he had just left them on site because they were going to be bringing the push button phones, and they were going to be installing jacks in the wall for them to plug them into and then give them a little training session. But I had gone there again. I had been called in to discuss this with the gentleman again, and he had a few questions. And knowing that I was going out there, the technician asked whether I could pick up that box of old dial phones that were all disconnected and with the cords wrapped all around them. So after I spoke with the gentleman, answered his questions, he said, just, the box of phones is down in the basement. Go ahead, go into the basement, flip on the light switch and grab those and have a good day. So when I went down into the basement and flicked the light switch on, I went down there alone. There's nobody else down there. And I looked around looking for this box of phones. And I didn't see it at first. But what was quite peculiar and disturbing and a little unsettling was I heard a telephone ringing. And it was the way these old dial phones would ring. It was it was a metal bell being hit with a clanger or whatever you want to call it. So the phone was ringing, and I'm thinking, okay, the technician forgot to unplug one of the telephones. So I went down and I looked around. I just followed the sound of that bell ringing, that phone ringing, and I went and found the box, and the ringing was coming from one of the phones that had been removed from the wall. That 25 pair cable had been ripped out of the wall, so it was not plugged in. And I'm thinking, how the hell is this phone even ringing? So it was ringing and ringing. So I unwound the cord that was wrapped around it, and I picked up the handset, a very heavy, clunky handset. And just for fun, I went, hello, hello. And there was static on the line, just a crackling of static. And I heard that for maybe, not very long, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 seconds. And I thought that was bizarre. Why would that phone even ring? Because it wasn't plugged in. Made no sense. Why would there be static on a phone that isn't plugged in? So I took those phones and carried that box out and basically put them in the back seat of my car. And it was late in the day, so I wasn't going back to the office. I was driving home. And by this point, it was starting to get dark. So I drive home, and on the way home, wouldn't you know it, I hear that phone ringing again. And it's not like when you hit a bump and maybe that clanger just hits the bell, but it was actually ringing. So I reached back and grabbed the phone, and it was the same phone. I could tell because the other ones were all tightly wrapped up with their cords. This one I just loosely wrapped around it after picking it up the first time. So again, I grabbed that phone. I picked up the handset, listened, and I heard just the crackling of static for like 5 seconds, and then it was dead. So that was very bizarre. And even after that, I would swear for years, I ended up keeping that one phone. I had to sign a release with the phone company because they were going to be destroying all of these phones anyways, because it was old technology. They had no use for it. They weren't going to be sending them to third world countries. So just for fun, because it was so strange, I asked if I could have that phone. And they said, no problem. Management said, as long as you sign this release and, you get it. So I got it, and then I ended up having a technician from the phone company basically rewire it for me. So they removed that 25 pair cable and put in a regular thin cord with a jack at the end so it could plug into the wall. And that phone actually worked. You would dial the big dial, pick up the big, heavy, clunky handset, and you could actually make phone calls. over the years, a lot of times I ended up putting that phone in the basement. I had it plugged in for a while, and sometimes I would hear it ringing when someone called. And then I ended up just removing it at some point and putting it into a box and putting it to storage in my basement. And many times in the middle of the night, I could swear I could hear that metallic bell ringing in the basement of that phone. And I still have that phone to this day. I have it sitting in my basement. It's not plugged in, but it does work. And I'm just wondering why there's that static on the line, why that phone was ringing in the first place. It's kind of a neat thing, but doesn't rationally make any sense why a telephone that's not plugged in would even ring.
Thanks for hanging out in the shack with us. If you've got a strange story, theory, or even just a spooky question, send it to shackpackinbox@gmail.com because we'd love to hear from you. Follow us to ensure that you never miss an episode of The Freaking Shack, because listening to us is much cheaper than therapy and slightly more spooky. Until we meet again next week, Shackpackers, take care.